So welcome to this session. I saw that you have posed some questions in the discussion forum, and many of them have been very nicely answered already by several people, including Prakash. But also, I'm very happy to see Ratnashri, who is an expert in this area, and she has been very active in answering your questions. So my job has become much simpler. So Ratnashri, thank you very much, and you can continue to contribute. So that will be fantastic. You will really be a great asset to this large group of students, and you can really help them. I think repeatedly a question that is being asked is the distinction between coherent and incoherent emission. And, probably the concept of this is not very clear because people don't come across this in this manner every day in a regular situation. But we do have ample examples of coherent and incoherent emission around us. So let me just give an example so that the meaning of what we consider coherent and incoherent becomes somewhat clearer. So let's take iron rod, put it in a fire, and it gets heated up. You can bring it out from the heat, and you will see a red glow from it. So that red glow is part of a radiation. It's because the iron rod is now hot. You can see that there is a radiation being emitted. And this radiation is incoherent. This radiation is incoherent because there are a large number of charged particles which are present in this iron rod, which are electrons. These electrons have got heated, and by heating one means that they have been given kinetic energy, and this kinetic energy is in a random fashion. So these electrons move independently of each other in a random fashion in arbitrary directions. And the acceleration that they experience in the process causes them to radiate. This acceleration can come due to interaction with the ions in the system. So that's the primary Coulomb interaction, which is a main source of acceleration. And that causes them to radiate. So each of these electrons will contribute some intensity in that radiation. And what we will get is the sum of the intensities contributed by each of these single electrons, single charge particles. So that is an incoherent sum. So you look at the power emitted by each of these particles and then add them up. And that is the total power. So if you go back to the basics of the emitted power by a charge due to acceleration, then you will see that this quantity is proportional to the square of the charge of the electron, of the charged particle. So if there are capital N number of electrons in this system, then the total amount of power that you will obtain is proportional to capital N times E squared, because each electron is producing an emission which is proportional to the square of its charge. So there is E squared. And then there are N of them. So it is capital N times E squared. That is the total emission, the total power emitted by this source. Okay. So now let's take this iron rod. Let's take one more such iron rod. And then put them one next to another lengthwise. And attach an electric lead to the two ends, which are close to each other, but not touching, and then apply an AC voltage to it. So now, what will happen is, these two iron rods together now will start acting like a dipole antenna. And in this dipole antenna, the acceleration is provided by the imposed electric field. The imposed electric field is created by the AC voltage that you are applying. So the AC voltage has a sinusoidal cycle. It is positive in one half at one time and negative in the other half at another time. And then over a cycle, it switches. Now, when it is positive, then electrons are accelerated in that direction. When it is negative, electrons are decelerated or accelerated in the opposite direction. And this acceleration and deceleration are applied to all the electrons together in the same direction. So these electrons will keep moving up and down together. Now they are not random motions, each on its own. So if there are n electrons and all these n electrons move together, then it is like one single charge of n times E moving together. And they're all subjected to the same acceleration. So then the total power that will be emitted is like this big charge Q squared. The big charge Q is n times E. So you will have now a power radiated which is proportional to n squared times E squared. So this total emission is n times larger than the emission that you are getting from the incoherent addition. So this is an example of a coherent radiation where a radio antenna produces coherent radiation. When you use a radio antenna to produce transmit radio signal, that's a coherent radiation by the electrons in it. So this is how the distinction between coherent and incoherent emission occurs. So where you have coherent emission, there is a large bunch of charges. They all share the same motion. Now, this large bunch of charges sharing the same motion also need to be the large bunch of charges all close together. Because if a charge is moving in a certain way here in Pune, and another charge is moving the same way in Calcutta, together they are not going to be able to produce coherent radiation because they are too far away from each other. So what do we mean by too far away? When we have radiation of a certain wavelength, when you have a motion of a certain frequency, that frequency creates a radiation of that wavelength. So let's say in this antenna that I was saying, I'm applying a AC voltage of a certain frequency f. Then an electromagnetic radiation will be generated at that frequency f. And that frequency f has a wavelength lambda. If two charges happen to be separated by distances which are much larger than lambda, then their radiation cannot add coherently. So for the emission of charges considered like one charge moving together, they have to be in close proximity within the wavelength of the radiation that you are generating. So this is, of course, much easier if the wavelength happens to be large or the frequency happens to be small. So that is, for example, the case for radio waves. So a radio wave may have several meters in size as wavelength, and you can pack many charges into it. But let's take gamma rays. So gamma rays will have sub-angstrom wavelength. And within the sub-angstrom wavelength, you cannot pack many charges in it. So you'll not be able to easily make coherent radiation in gamma rays, where it is much easier in radio. And this is what happens in pulsar magnetosphere as well. When you look at high energy emission, there are electrons, of course, large bunches of electrons producing these emission. But what we have there is the intensity of emission of these individual charges at high energy radiation. So we call that incoherent. Whereas in radio, you can have a large bunch of charges moving together and acting like a single charge, and that produces a coherent radiation. So I hope this has clarified a little bit. I don't know if there are further questions on this, you can ask me.
Deepankar, this is Indulekha.
Yes.
What about bulk movement, but random motions in the plasma will also be present?
The bulk movement, if there is a bulk acceleration, then you can have, if all charges moving together has a bulk acceleration. So, and if the radiation from that is significant, then the wavelength that corresponds to that frequency at which this bulk acceleration is producing radiation, charge bunches within that, you can consider them coherent.
In the case of pulsars, at least when it's when these charge bunches are coherently emitting, there won't be any random motions, right? It will all be constrained along the magnetic field lines.
That is correct. I mean, that is of course idealized. I mean, it is not as though the thermal velocities are zero. There is a very small component of thermal agitation, which is much smaller than the Lorentz factors that the bulk motion contribute. So yes, practically the random motions are very limited, but they're not non-zero.
When we see the spectrum of pulsars from the radio to the gamma rays, we see coherent emission in the radio part and incoherent emission in the optical to gamma rays. So is it okay to consider that in the radio part there is only coherent emission, or it is a mixture of coherent as well as incoherent, but the incoherent part is very less, so we ignore it or something like that?
Yeah, I think the latter is correct. Now, when you see the incoherent emission from these charges, the emission is very broadband. So there is a certain component in the radio as well. But given the spectrum, as you have seen, the contribution of incoherent emission in the radio band is very, very tiny. And the coherent emission dominates in radio.
So if we say, if we extract something, if we somehow extract the coherent emission part, then will we see something like black body at the radio part?
Pulsars, I mean, major component of pulsar radiation is not black body. As you would have seen, it's a power law, right?
Yes.
It comes from the magnetosphere due to these acceleration processes, rather than a hot surface. It is not to say that there is no hot surface. There is a hot surface of a neutron star, and that does radiate. And particularly in X-rays, you can see a component of it. So even in X-rays, for many of the pulsars for which this has been seen, magnetospheric emission may still dominate, but you can separate that component of the spectrum and then look for the black body emission from the surface. Now, that black body emission does have all frequencies. It will also go down to radio. But compared to the radio emission that we see from pulsars, the black body from the thermal emission from the surface is so small that it's completely impractical to try to find it by subtracting the coherent emission.
The thermal emission you just mentioned, so from which part it is coming? Like, what we infer from the thermal emission that we are detecting in pulsar, like it is coming from what
Yeah, from
part
the
of?
surface, because neutron stars are born very hot. The temperatures when they're born is about 1 million electron volt, which is like 10 to the power of 10 Kelvin. And over time, the neutron star cools down by thermal emission. And so a typical neutron star, which you see working as a pulsar and so on, its surface temperature is still about 1 million degrees or so. So it has a hot black body coming from the surface. In addition, these magnetospheric processes where particle acceleration and so on occurs, which we will discuss in forthcoming lectures, that process can also result in some fast moving particles moving towards the surface and colliding with it and heating some part of it. So that also can contribute additionally to the heat that is there at the surface. So these two together gives you a fairly hot surface. But the stellar radius is quite small. It is 10 kilometers compared to the sun, for example, right? So you'll because the emission, black body emission, is proportional to temperature to the power of 4, but also proportional to radius squared. And because this radius is very small for a neutron star, the total thermal emission is actually very small compared to all the other sources of radiation that we see from the object.
Sir, if the pulsar is in binary, so they will accrete the matter around itself. So can we say that this thermal emission is also contributed from the matter accreting around the pulsar?
Yeah. So if it is an accreting neutron star, which we are not going to discuss in this course very much actually. So if it is an accreting neutron star, then of course the accreted matter is hot to start with, even before it falls on the surface. So large amount of X-rays are emitted by the accretion disk even before the matter reaches the surface. And when it reaches the surface gets hot. And you get a boundary layer of the accreted matter as well as the surface, where you get X-rays. So you can get a hot surface. A large fraction of the X-rays that you see from accreting neutron stars comes from that. That's hot matter.
Thank you, sir.
Professor Dipankar?
Yes.
Yes, good evening, sir.
Yeah, good evening.
So I was watching a lecture on pulsars by Professor G. Srinivasan, in which he had mentioned that pulsars are dynamos. So I wanted to ask that, does that mean if a pulsar is acting as a dynamo, so does that mean all the X-ray radiation will be coherent because a voltage is created and all the particles will move along the field lines?
No. Dynamo is a sort of gross way of capturing the fact that when you take a magnet and you rotate it, then you get an electric potential drop, right? And that electric potential drop is responsible for all the acceleration processes that generate high energy particles in the pulsar magnetosphere. The radiation is a subsequent process created by these particles. And these particles can produce either incoherent radiation or coherent radiation depending on their random motion as well as the wavelength of the radiation that we are talking about. I have already mentioned before why you get coherent radiation when the wavelength is very long, whereas when the wavelength is very short, it is very hard to get coherent radiation because there will be very few particles you can pack within the wavelength of X-rays or gamma rays. So X-rays or gamma rays are not coherent. Even optical is not coherent from these objects. Except in radio, we don't have any evidence of coherent emission.
Hello, sir. When in the first lecture, you had mentioned that the gamma ray emission, the pulse peak, as well as the radio pulse peak, don't necessarily align, but it's aligned in the case of crab. But there is no definite correlation in general. So
crab
is that
an
indicate?
exception. Almost, crab is an exception.
Okay.
Almost in no other case there is any alignment between the two.
So is that indicative of different physical processes happening at different phases of the neutron star, or is there some lagging or some other reprocessing that is causing this kind of shift in phase between these emission?
No, I think it's simply that they originate in different parts of the magnetosphere. So something originates far out, gamma rays probably originate close to the light cylinder, whereas radio originates much closer to the stellar surface. And so there is no reason to expect that these two will come in phase.
In the case of certain magnetars, from what I look at the literature, there is a correlation between the optical as well as X-ray kind of, those pulse peaks. Well, it's not the case in accreting pulsars, of course, but does that indicate that these are from the same region or
yes,
from?
Even in radio pulsars, optical X-rays and gamma rays and so on, they are often originating from nearby regions, whereas radio is in most cases disjoint. So you will have to consider these two as two different mechanisms. The optical to gamma rays, which are typically incoherent synchrotron emission. So they are, although there could be some differences, I mean, there are some pulsars where optical and X-ray profiles also don't match. But in many cases, they are not too far from each other. So they are originate in some part of the magnetosphere, whereas radio, which often is completely different in shape, originates from somewhere else. We will discuss some of these things in later part of this course.
Okay. So one more thing is that in the pulse profiles, the peaks are very sharp in radio, where it's quite broad in gamma ray as well as X-ray. Is that a method of saying how coherent the emission is, or
not necessarily? It could, for gamma rays, what one thinks is that the emission region is very well distributed. So even if from a small part of this region, you are getting a highly beamed emission, but there are many such beams which cross your line of sight as the pulsar rotates. So therefore, the emission gets spread out over a large set of longitudes. So it is not that you have specifically some other mechanism which is responsible for it. But the beaming, the narrowness of the radio beam has to do with not necessarily coherence, but the relativistic beaming. The particles are highly relativistic coming towards you. So each particle will have its radiation confined within an angle which is 1 over the Lorentz factor, and the Lorentz factor could be in millions. So it will be a very, very tiny angle. And now, so therefore, if the particle is moving along a field line, then you will practically see only that field line. So it just depends on how many such field lines your line of sight crosses as the pulsar rotates, and that decides the width of the pulse. So in radio, that is a small set of angles over which these field lines will cross your line of sight. In gamma rays, when we go well out to the light cylinder, the field lines open up. The same field lines will cover a much larger range of angles. And so therefore, you will see a much broader profile.
So one more thing. Here, a model that we consider the dipolar model for neutron stars, and what I've read so far is also the fact that the depending on what the angle between the magnetic axis and the rotation axis is, you might see a single peak or a double peak or a complex profile. So is there any way of saying that it's more than dipolar, probably a quadrupolar thing by looking at the pulse profiles? Has any such thing been observationally found?
You can have multiple field near the surface, but in the emission region, which is even radio is hundreds of kilometers away from the surface, and the high energy emission probably comes from many thousands of kilometers away from the surface. So over that range, already you know the dipole falls off as 1 by r cubed. All other multipoles will fall off as much, much faster. So in the emission region where the radiation really originates, the local field is likely very close to dipole, right? Or the dipole which is modified by the motion of the plasma, which we will see later in the course. But the intrinsic field at those distances will mainly be dipole. Very hard to have very strong multipole field surviving those distances.
Essentially, as seeing as it from this distance, it will be mostly dipolar with additional multipolar components as corrections to it. So we may not
will be extremely small at those distances. But once you go near the surface, the corrections could be large.
Okay.
So the region where the particles are initially accelerated, which could be very close to the polar cap, there you can have the effect of multiple fields quite strongly, right? And so those strong multiple fields can determine where the pairs will be produced. So which field lines will be populated with charged particles, which field lines will be not. Which field lines will get more particles, which field lines will get less. And eventually, these particles will come and radiate in the dipole field lines. But the distribution of number distribution of particles along these different field lines is determined by a multipole field close to the surface. And this is what likely gives you the very characteristic shape of the pulse of each pulsar. For each pulsar has a very unique shape of its own, of its pulse profile. And that very likely originates from the multipole pattern of magnetic fields near the surface.
Just to go back to that coherent emission and the radio being dominated by coherent emission, does that can that be converted to a statement about length scales involved in the phenomenon?
Yes, what we require are bunches, charge bunches, which are smaller than the radio wavelength. So this is an essential part of the radio emission mechanism. So whenever you try to construct a radio emission mechanism of pulsars, you will have to have assume that there are a large number of charges within the wavelength.
No, I was thinking of the magnetosphere itself.
Yes.
Scales there in the plasma.
I'm not sure I've fully understood your question. It is of course, the magnetosphere we are talking about. The emission is from charged particles which are moving through the magnetosphere, right? And to get coherent emission, you will have to have charge bunches which are smaller than the wavelength being radiated. So you will have intermittent supply of charges, and each of these individual charge supply bursts creates a bunch, and this bunch is smaller than the radio wavelength. Then you will get the strong coherent emission from these bunches.
So can we relate it to the correlation length scales?
Yeah, so or you can state this as the correlation length of the charge bunches being less than the radio wavelengths.
Okay.
Correlation length will be smaller than the radio wavelength. So then you will get coherent emission within that. Then what happens is, in practice, this single particle kind of emission picture is a bit too naive and simplified. So we don't really have single particle emission, bunches of charges all moving together and so on, but it is a plasma process. So when you have a plasma process, you can have coherent emission like maser emission mechanisms or antenna emission mechanisms, where the plasma itself makes a collective motion of a certain pattern. And that will produce coherent emission as well. So most likely what happens in radio emission is that rather than looking at the emission as being independent single particles just moving, just happen to be moving coherently together. So this again, we will come back to towards the end of this lecture series.
I was thinking about, I mean, is it modes or could one think of turbulence and length scales there?
I don't think turbulence is of major consequence here because the plasma supply, plasma production itself is intermittent. Because you have charges which you produce, then as soon as charges are produced, the accelerating voltage gets extinguished because the charges will bring the, it will neutralize the voltage. So then the charges will move out. Once the charges move out, the voltage starts again, and then another bunch of charges are produced. So these are individual sparks, like individual lightnings. So each lightning produces a bunch of particles, which then will radiate later. And that is a major source of these bunches and short coherence length and so on. Turbulence is not of that great importance here.
Okay.
Vijay, you have a question? You can unmute yourself now.
Good evening, sir.
Hello.
Sir, the question is, you spoke of the Keplerian limit in one of those lectures, like a star would break apart if it rotates too fast. Has any such event been observed with respect to a neutron star?
We do not know of any neutron star which is rotating at the Keplerian limit. And we will, I'm not sure we will discuss this in these lectures. We might, I'm not sure whether I have said it in the equation of state lecture. There are reasons by which the neutron star will spin down even before it can reach the Keplerian limit. Suppose a neutron star was born from a very fast rotating stellar core, and it was rotating near the Keplerian limit, it will almost immediately spin down to longer periods. And that is because there are gravitational waves, which is the largest contributor to spin down at such very short periods. And then, of course, also the electromagnetic spin down. Yes. The magnetic field is strong, then it will produce an electromagnetic torque and it will spin down very quickly. So it is very unlikely that you will actually find a neutron star which is remaining near the Keplerian spin down, Keplerian speed. And so far we have not found it, but we have found something which is close to it, which is shorter than, which is almost close to a millisecond. Keplerian period is about half a millisecond.
Okay, sir. Sir, like one of the most famous examples of is observable pulsar or a supernova, whatever, like in any way, a pulsar which can be observed in a significant way, either directly or through the presence of supernova around it, like the Crab Nebula. Are there any other examples, like the ones which can be easily viewed with an amateur telescope? Anything related to a pulsar?
You're talking about pulsar nebula to be viewed by amateur telescope.
Yes, just like the Crab Nebula. Any other example?
Yeah, the Crab Nebula is one of the brightest ones.
Yes, sir.
I'm not sure an amateur telescope will do, but there are other many other nebulae known like the Crab Nebula which are further away. There is a very bright one in the Large Magellanic Cloud.
Okay, sir.
But it probably requires a bit more than an amateur telescope to see it. So you probably require a relatively large telescope.
Okay, sir. Sir, one last question. Like, unlike the sun, are quantum tunneling effects important in a neutron star?
Inside, yes. I mean, in the when you find out what is the equilibrium state of matter at the very center of the neutron star and so on, then all those effects are important. They decide what is the equilibrium between different possible particles, states in that area.
Sir, you mentioned that in a light emitting cone, our line of sight cuts, that's the only way we can observe the radiation coming from pulsar. But this light cone is also has latitude as well as longitude. So how do we know that our line of sight is at which latitude in that particular light cone?
We don't know that. In pulsars, we don't know what is the latitude at which we are cutting the cone. But what we can measure from the polarization signature is what is the angle between the spin axis and the magnetic axis, right? So, and we can also say what is the angle between the magnetic axis and the view axis. So now you take a cone which is of width, the angle between the magnetic axis and the view axis, and go around the magnetic axis. So that will create a trajectory. And all those latitudes which fall within that trajectory is allowed from whatever we are seeing. But if something outside that limit, then we will not have seen the pulsar. So that gives you an idea as to what range of latitudes are allowed given the polarization signature that we view. But it is not a single latitude, it's a range of latitudes. It could be anywhere within that.
Okay, sir. And sir, my second question is, in pulsar, we observe a very large magnetic field. And I read that it's due to the flux conservation from the main sequence star when it's converted to a neutron star. So can you explain a little bit that how this flux conservation occurs?
Okay, flux conservation is a possibility. I mean, that is one of the conjectures as to how the neutron stars get their strong field. And flux conservation is easy because in astrophysics, you see that happening all the time. So what it means is that if you have a magnetic flux crossing a certain area, right? You know what a magnetic flux means, right? If
Yes,
you
sir.
take an arbitrary area, you take the magnetic field and then integrate the magnetic field times the area element across that entire area. So if you have a uniform field crossing a circle of radius r, then pi r squared times b is your magnetic flux. So you take any star, let's take the sun. You have magnetic field that crosses its surface, and you have the whole surface. You take the local magnetic field and then multiply by the area of the surface, then you have magnetic flux. If the conductivity of the material is very high, then if you change the shape or size of this object, then many things can change, but the magnetic flux remains conserved. This is Gauss's law. So you can squeeze the star from, let's say, 1,000,000 kilometer radius to 10-kilometer radius. So you have squeezed the star by a factor 10 to the power of 5. So surface area has gone up, surface area has gone down by a factor of 10 to the power of 10. If the conductivity is high, flux has not been lost, then the flux crossing the surface now will be the same as the flux that was crossing the surface when the star was big. So in case of the sun, the average dipole magnetic field crossing the surface is about a Gauss or so. But if you take that and convert the sun to a star of 10 kilometer radius, conserving the flux, then that 1 Gauss will become 10 to the power of 10 Gauss, right? So you'll get a flux amplification by a factor of 10 to the power of 10. So this is what, sorry, not flux amplification, field amplification by a factor of 10 to the power of 10, keeping the flux constant, right? So that is how it's sort of easy to produce strong magnetic fields. All it needs is that the plasma has to be highly conducting. That means the ohmic dissipation of the magnetic energy should be small. Then this is a simple consequence of Gauss's law.
And sir, one more thing, that are there any magnetic field line recombination phenomena occurring on the neutron star or not?
Reconnections.
Yes, sir, reconnection.
It can happen, but it will be driven by plasma. So the regions where plasma density is very high, you will see later on, there are some current sheets which probably exist in the magnetosphere, and the current sheets can go all the way to the light cylinder and outside. And in those areas where the strength of the magnetic field is relatively low and the kinetic energy of the plasma is relatively high, in those regions you can get magnetic reconnection. But this magnetic reconnection is not draining the magnetic energy of the pulsar itself, the magnetic dipole. What it does is it takes, because of plasma motion, additional magnetic field is created. So magnetic field lines are taken and they are twisted around. So the twist means that you take the original magnetic field and you add some extra magnetic field to it. And this extra magnetic field is created by the current that is produced due to the motion of the plasma. And these extra magnetic field bits can recombine and release that energy. So which is ultimately coming from the kinetic energy of the plasma. So it is one of the methods of converting the kinetic energy of the plasma into heat.
So as you mentioned in your lecture that radiation from a relativistic charge will be beamed. So yes. I want to know what is the direction of this beam? I mean, like what kind of polarization will this radiation have if it is beamed?
Beaming and polarization are two different things. The beaming occurs because for a fast moving charge, which is moving fast with respect to the observer, the radiation, the entire forward hemisphere of the charge gets beamed into a cone of width 1 over the Lorentz factor, right? So if the charge is at rest with respect to you, the entire radiation that you will see being radiated over one hemisphere is now confined to a small cone of cone width 1 over the Lorentz factor. So the higher the Lorentz factor, the smaller is the cone width. But this property of this entire hemisphere of radiation is preserved within that cone. So let's take charge in a circular motion in a magnetic field. So cyclotron radiation, when the charge is at rest with respect to you. So there, if you see the emission from a direction which is in the plane of the orbit, then you will see a linear radiation, linear polarization. Whereas if you look at it from a direction which is perpendicular to the orbit, you will see circular polarization. And this difference occurs. So now look at the motion of the charge, look at the velocity of the charge. So if your line of sight is parallel to the velocity, then in that plane you see linear polarization. Whereas if it is perpendicular to the velocity, then you see circular polarization. So that is a difference of 90 degrees in your view direction. And this 90 degrees difference actually constitutes one hemisphere of emission from the charge. When you make this charge move relativistically, this hemisphere will get squeezed into this 1 over gamma cone. So at the center of the 1 over gamma cone, you will see linear radiation. At the edge of the 1 over gamma cone, you will see circular radiation, circularly polarized radiation. So the original character is preserved. It's just that it gets squeezed into a small set of angles.
Sir, and what effect does this have on the separation of Landau levels that you mentioned? Will they remain the separation between the Landau levels will change if the particle is relativistic or the charge is relativistic?
Of course, because the Landau level spacing is charge times the magnetic field divided by the Lorentz factor times the mass of the particles times speed of light. So it will depend on the Lorentz factor.
Yeah. Is it okay to consider one phase of the pulse profile corresponds to only single frequency? Means only if we pick up on a single phase of the pulse profile, will it corresponds to a single frequency? Because the beam is so narrow, can we consider that it is coming from a single charge bunch at a particular height?
No. One phase of the pulse is one angle in your longitude, in the rotation, right? Emission comes from all over the magnetosphere at every phase. So you will see emission from emission at many different frequencies at the same pulse longitude.
But the beam is very narrow, like 1 over 1 over 1000 degree, means 0.001 or something for a Lorentz factor of 1000.
That is for a single charge, but there are multiple charges and there are field lines nearby. So you will see a whole bunch of field lines at any small range of longitudes. And in a given field line, the angle changes as you go away from the star. So a field line points to you at a certain longitude at one height. It will point to you at a different longitude at another height, right? Because it is not a straight line. It's a curved field line. So from some other field line, charges moving in some other field line at a different height will also contribute to radiation at the same longitude. So at every longitude, the emission is quite broadband. You'll see many frequencies. Don't think of the magnetic field lines being like a single cone. It's a diverging cone. And because it's a diverging cone which keeps opening up, the same magnetic field line will produce radiation at different phases, at different heights.
So Debajyoti had put the question on the chat.
Yes.
So the person essentially wants to know, apart from radiation from neutron stars, whether particles themselves can be detected on Earth. Particles from the pulsar, I suppose.
So far, we have not had any signature of particles coming directly from a neutron star. We do see cosmic rays. Some high energy particles could be accelerated in pulsar magnetospheres and then arrive at us. And some of the particles we high energy cosmic rays we see could have come from pulsars, but we don't have a clear identification at this point of time. But electrons, of course, we will not see from that, but only very high energy charged particles. It is possible. But so far, there is no clear identification that something is coming only clearly from a pulsar.
Jay, do you want to ask a question?
Yes, hello, sir. This is just a follow-up question to the one that was previously addressed about the conservation of magnetic flux. So when when the star collapses, you mentioned that the field strength is about the order of 1 Gauss to 10 Gauss, and then it gets converted to about 10 to the power 10 Gauss when the neutron stars form. So during the collapse or after the collapse, are there any other amplification mechanisms in action that lead to, say, 10 to the power 12 to 10 to the power 14, like magnetar-like field strengths?
Yes, I mean, first of all, we know that it is the core of the massive star that collapses, right? And the core of the massive star can have magnetic field strengths larger than what we see at the solar surface. There could be hundreds of Gauss of magnetic field at the core of a normal massive star. So that already, when you collapse it, it will give you 10 to the 12, 10 to the 13 Gauss. There is no problem with that. But people think that there are additional processes. It is not necessary that this field comes from pure flux conservation from pre-collapse core. Very strong dynamo mechanism can take place during the collapse, and you can create, in principle, you can create magnetic fields as strong as 10 to the power 17, 10 to the power 18 Gauss. Whether in practice that occurs, we don't know. And on the surface, we have not seen such high fields. But there is a possibility of kinetic dynamo that can occur due to turbulence during the process of collapse, during the last stages of collapse, which can produce very strong fields. But the catch is that such a field is not going to be very stable, because once you create this and then just leave it, then all the loops sort of realign themselves to cancel out the magnetic moment as far as possible. So you need to have some additional input like helicity and so on to stabilize the magnetic field. Ultimately, how much magnetic field will remain even if you create 10 to the power 17, 10 to the power 18 Gauss is an open question. But what we do see is the maximum fields of the order of 10 to the power 14, 10 to the power 15 Gauss at the surface. So inside the star, there could be even stronger fields, which we don't know.
Oh, thank you, sir.
Shyam, you can unmute yourself and ask.
Yes. In the context of gravitational wave, I mean, when two pulsars or neutron star coalesces to produce gravitational waves, in the research paper, I have seen that they have calculated the tidal effect or tidal love number in the quadrupole moment approximation. Actually, I want to know why only quadrupole moment is involved only, and does every stars produces tidal effect for creating gravitational wave? And this is the one question. And one more question, maybe silly. Actually, I didn't get the answer. That's why I'm asking to Deepankar sir. In case of sound wave, this is a very basic. I know the answer, but I didn't understand that. In case of sound wave, because the wave depends on the medium, that's why there is a Doppler shift and all that. But in case of sound, it doesn't depend on the media. Still, there is a Doppler effect. The answer I didn't know, or I didn't get the answer. Can you please explain?
Anyway, let me answer your first question first, and that is tidal effect. Yes, any two stars are made of anything. If you subject it to a tidal field, it will have a tidal distortion. So what do you mean by tidal field? It is a gravitational field which has a varying intensity as a function of distance, right? So if you bring one star next to another star, there will be a tidal effect. How much deformation will occur in a tidal field will depend on the internal structure of the star. And this is why the measure of tidal deformation can tell us something about the interior of neutron stars. When you bring two stars close to each other, you do get tidal deformation, and that tidal deformation can tell you how stiff the star is. And how stiff the star is depends on the internal composition. It is a quadrupole that people are talking about is the mass quadrupole, the quadrupole component of the mass distribution. So when you deform a star, it will deform itself into multiple moments, right? So there will be several multiple moments where you can decompose that shape into. Quadrupole is the first moment which can give rise to gravitational waves. Quadrupole mass distribution is required to give rise to gravitational waves. If there is no quadrupole, then there is no gravitational wave. So it is quadrupole and higher which gives rise to gravitational waves. And of course, among all the multipoles, they will have decreasing strength as you go to higher orders. So quadrupole is the first important order which gives rise to gravitational waves. So when you measure gravitational waves, you measure the quadrupole distortion. And so then you try to link it back to how much deformation there was of the star. So the Tyrrell lab number comes from there. So I hope I have answered that question. Secondly,
so first term is the quadrupole moment that is contributing.
Yes, first term is
okay. Just like in case of charge, it may be dipole moment or like that.
That is correct. In case of electromagnetism, it is dipole.
Okay.
In case of gravitational radiation, it is quadrupole.
Yes. Okay. And you told that it depends on the interior of the star. Interior means the compact stars are of the same densities. I mean, so what does it mean differ by interior?
No, different masses will have different density.
Okay,
So,
it's masses. It's masses,
yes.
not the composition.
The idea is not that. The fact is that in neutron stars, we actually don't know what the internal composition is. There is no first principles theory of it. So there are many different conjectures. Each conjecture gives you a different stiffness. So if you can measure the stiffness, then you can narrow down what the internal composition might be. Because there is
constituents. Constituents particles can we guess?
Yes, that is the idea.
Okay.
Once you have enough measurements, you should be able to tell that.
Okay.
So these measurements are trying to put constraints on the kind of behavior of particles, the forces between particles inside neutron stars.
Okay. By measuring lab number or deformation. Okay.
That is right.
Okay.
So, and the second question was about Doppler effect. Doppler effect does not require a medium. It is the relative motion between the source and the observer is itself enough to produce Doppler effect. In case of sound, you need a medium to propagate, and then you can express this in terms of the speed with respect to the medium. But in case of light, you don't need a medium. So a simple relativistic transformation, Lorentz transformation between one frame to another will immediately show you the Doppler effect.
Actually, somewhere I found that the reason is something like simultaneity of events like that. That's why I didn't get that one.
Special relativity, right? That's what is Lorentz transformation. It's the relativity of simultaneity which gives you the special relativistic effects.
Yes.
Events that are simultaneous in one frame is not simultaneous in another frame.
Yes.
Maybe we can take a few questions from the chat. There was one
I think
question.
we could take a few questions from the chat and then we wind up this session for today.
Yes.
So I just couldn't unmute myself. I just wanted to ask about this frozen fields versus dynamo fields. The frozen field would have a stable multipole structure. Would you expect that for a dynamo?
No. There is no need to, no reason to expect that the stable, the frozen field will be any more stable than the dynamo field. Stability comes from helicity. If the frozen field already has a helicity which has made it stable, then it will continue. If the dynamo field, when it gets created, also has significant helicity, it will also stay. But It's not whether it is frozen or dynamo generated, it is the amount of helicity in the field, either originally or in the newly generated field, that matters.
There's a question from the chat from Jyoti Wal.
Yeah.
The person asks if since gamma rays are created by synchrotron emission near the light cylinder, the question is if curvature radiation can be near surface, then why synchrotron process takes place near light cylinder where the magnetic field is low and so is the particle energy?
No, so you can have synchrotron near the surface. That produces a very strong energy loss, and very, very quickly the momentum of the particle perpendicular to the magnetic field is radiated away. So to produce synchrotron emission, particle has to be moving perpendicular to the magnetic field. It has to have a momentum which is perpendicular to the component of the momentum which is perpendicular to the field. Near the surface, the field is so strong that you can have a synchrotron emission to start with, but in an instant, the particle comes to the lowest Landau level. So therefore, there is no momentum left perpendicular to the magnetic field. So therefore, no further synchrotron radiation can occur. The original synchrotron photons that you may have generated, those photons will immediately interact with the magnetic field and produce charges and produce electron-positron pairs. And they will then again do the same process and then just increase the number of charges, all of which are moving parallel to the field and not perpendicular to the field. So if you move parallel to the field, there is no synchrotron emission possible. By the time the charges reach the light cylinder, then the field is low and the requirement, requirement of energy to go to the next Landau level becomes smaller. So the charges can then go to higher and higher Landau levels where the perpendicular momentum with respect to the magnetic field builds up. And once you have perpendicular momentum with respect to the magnetic field, then you can do synchrotron radiation again. So that's the reason why it is more important near the light cylinder than close to the surface.
So some of the questions in the chat has already been answered during the answer to other questions. I would request the ones that have not been answered to be put in the forums, and we can either answer it there or take it up the next session. Maybe we can end by taking just one question from Shubham. You can unmute yourself and ask.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Sir, maybe, sir, it's a different question from like what we are having the lectures. It's on pulsar, but there's tidal dispersion events around supermassive black holes, like the accreting black holes. So in literatures, I have read in that while they form torus and then after ultimately forming the disk and while they are accreting, they forms a reprocessing layer far behind the tidal disruption radius. So that reprocessing layer is basically converting the internal X-rays and UV radiations that are basically coming from some thermal region, a very hot thermal region. So that radiation, X-ray and UV are converting to optical, and that's why we see more optical TDs in supermassive black holes. So is that the case? I'm matching the scenario, like I'm getting to like some inference, like as you mentioned that if the neutron star is also accreting, so
accreting neutron stars do so reprocess radiation. The neutron star produces X-ray, and then the X-rays get reprocessed from the accretion disk, and you see that part in optical. It's exactly the same thing that happens.
That scenario for reprocessing layer is same in the accreting neutron star.
Radio? No, not in radio. You see it in optical.
Yeah, we see in optical, like I'm asking like that reprocessing layer that we discussed in the accreting supermassive black holes. So the same scenario is with the accreting neutron stars that we see X-rays reprocessed.
Accreting neutron stars and black holes show this quite prominently, the stellar mass objects. And it is that experience which is now being applied to TDEs. It was not discovered for the first time in TDEs.
Okay.
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks a lot, Pankaj.
All right, thank you.